What's going on, YouTube? As everyone knows, season 2 is here, and we have the wonderful Sharen. I really like Sharen. I liked her in the betas. I liked her in season 1, and now she has buffs and an ultimate. So let's dive into what I believe are some really good Sharen combos and Sharen builds. Before we get into Sharen builds, I would like to say that the best mounted weapon that you would use on the new reactors, which on the new reactor system, it is a type anyway. So you would want scout rifle specifically for blue beetle. Blue beetle has since been buffed and now gives you a skill critical hit rate of 115% added onto your stack. At a base skill critical hit rate of 20%, Sharen sports an extremely high skill critical hit rate. So whenever you cast one of your fusion abilities, this more than doubles. This 1.4 is the skill critical hit damage, and it is being increased by the reactor currently. So if we cast a fusion skill, you can see that we are at 43. We have been given an additional 23% increase to our skill critical hit rate. There is another ability called active camouflage, which puts you in an ambush state. The ambush gives you an additional 22% skill critical hit rate increase and a firearm increase of 22% for critical hit as well. However, these do not show up inside of the stats. For instance, I'm at 20. You can see the hood buff, and then whenever it ends, you get the ambush buff, and I am still at 20. This is simply just because it affects the outgoing stuff. It is not a passive buff, so you just can't see it. Maybe this might change in the future, but if we give ourselves some enemies, you can see some of them are crits, and then many more are crits whenever I activate it while ambush is procced. Or at least the attacks that are outgoing when ambush is procced. So as you can tell, this only works for the initial hit going out of the buff. This is an important play mechanic that comes into play later. First, I'll go over the base skills of Sharen and sort of her kit. Sharen is an assassin type. She typically uses the cutoff beam to get enemies off of her. This is a slash that is 4x4x6 in a small rectangle in front of her. Active camouflage is sort of her bread and butter. You use this to go invisible, and after doing so, you get a skill critical hit rate increase and an outgoing damage increase of 100%, which means you double the damage and then you get a crit buff. You also increase your movement speed by a little bit. The shock nuts is now dealing damage. It did not used to deal damage before. It just did the stun, and the stun has also been buffed to a duration of 5.3. This is a very good ability now, and due to the low cooldown, you can spam this and stun the majority of enemies around you. The flash short sword, the only problem with this ability is simply the lengthy animation time.
Would you like to use the laboratory?
The lengthy animation time takes quite a bit to set off and can be challenging. You can sort of mitigate this a little bit by jumping beforehand, but it doesn't really decrease it that much. If you activate your camouflage and then go into it, it gives you an even little shorter animation cancel time, but once again, there's not really anything you can do to mitigate the animation time of the flash sword. This has been massively buffed and now does the times 10 per monster. Take that last segment. Sharen's passive outgoing damage increases on attacking enemies that are not targeting you 15%. This makes Sharen notoriously terrible for testing. Whenever you're testing Sharen's passive will throw off your numbers if you're not aware of it. So just keep this in mind. As far as the Sharen build itself, I have chosen to go with maximum critical hit rate using the old modules, because the old modules will just give you more critical hit rate and critical hit damage on your build. Emergency measures, front lines, skill concentration, and skill insight are the go-tos. If you are going to remove one of them on this particular build with Sharen, removing front lines will net you a bigger damage loss than removing emergency measures, although they are very comparable to each other, so it doesn't really matter which one you pick if you just want an extra mod slot for something else. Then I have chosen to go with Focus on Electric simply for the cooldown, because cooldown is very important on Sharen, and even with her Transcendent module that decreases cooldown, it's still important to maximize your cooldown. Now, the difference between Focus on Electric Specialist is only a 4% increase. So you're really gaining way more out of your cooldown than you would out of a Specialist anyway. And the Master module in this situation is just inferior. Then we have Fusion Specialist. Fusion Specialist will increase the skill power modifier of her 4th and 1st ability, which will be your mainstays as damage goes. I have MP conversion and nimble fingers. Technically, yes, you can equip multi-talented and activate the active camouflage buff for some tech, which I'll show you how that works. So if I activate the 1st ability, you can see that it cools down pretty quickly. If I activate a multi-talented cooldown window first, I can spam this ability even better. Now, if you wanted to try to do this, this is fine. However, I think it's too much of a waste of MP to put on this particular build, and you'll end up just dumping your load and not having anything left. So the two best things I've experimented with and found are range and hit points. This particular version of Sharen is quite squishy, so if you want to stay alive more often, I highly recommend you slot in an HP amplification as well as an increased HP. If you're confident in the amount of ads that you're killing over time, you can also put a HP collector here. That would also work. But I prefer having a larger stack of HP to not get one shot, because even with 2 HP modules, I still only have 10,000 HP. Yes, you can take off Slayer set for more HP, but forget that. Give me my 26 extra % damage. Now we'll go into the Transcendent modules. Sharen has quite a few Transcendent modules. There is the Void Domination. With the recent buffs in Sharen, I do believe this to be her worst skill yet, simply because the max daggers flying towards one enemy can only equal 2. So if I were to activate my special, I could only hit them with 2 short swords. But with the recent buff, you can now hit them with 10 daggers, making Void Domination just inferior, in my opinion. There is everyone's bossing. This is the Overcharged Edge. The Overcharged Edge uses a portion of your shield in order to increase the outgoing damage. And with the new buff, you also get the skill critical hit and the firearm critical hit rate increase. In this case, I would actually recommend you slot in Overwhelming HP, simply because this activates a portion of your shield. If your shield is 1, you in fact have infinite resources because it does not take away your shield. So I'll activate this. You can see it does 10 million damage. 10 million damage every time. This is an insane amount of number, but that is a level 1 enemy. If you're fighting level 100 enemies, you can see about a 70% decrease, so that would do around 3 million. If I do not have Overwhelming Shield on, you can see I use my shield as a resource. And whenever your resource is depleted, you just simply won't be able to use that ability anymore. So if you're going to use Overcharged Edge for extra bossing damage, I do recommend Overwhelming HP. Before you go and say it's not good anymore because of a certain way it used to function where you could double tap, there is a couple options that didn't used to be there. We'll go to everyone's testing dummy, the Devourer, which I really wish we could just summon him in the lab, but that probably is kind of difficult. So keep in mind we have the blue beetle, so we want the crit rate from the blue beetle buff first. So before you activate your Overcharged Edge, you would want to activate your first ability to get that 10%, to get that 20% buff. You'll see the buff activated, then Overcharged Edge, and it deals a massive amount of damage.
Entering stealth state.
And there you have it. The laboratory. Yes, Sana, I would. Thank you. We will make the enemies level 100 because it is impossible to showcase what I want to. Gives you a defense decrease amount of 40%. Defense is only active on firearms. You can see that does 1.3 million. So the blue beetle does 147,000 on a crit and 81,000 on a not crit. Of course it's bugged. Why wouldn't it be bugged whenever I try to make a Sharen video? For a in-depth guide on the battlesuit melting rounds, please watch this video. It goes over a lot of stuff on how to use NAS for speedrunning and combining it with battlesuit melting rounds. Just know that whenever you are using battlesuit melting rounds combined with NAS, it's not really for solo play, it's to enhance the gun descendants that are with you. Side note, battlesuit melting rounds is bugged right now inside of Season 2. Then we have Release Cutting Force. Release Cutting Force is extremely good because it sports a very large range. The range of Release Cutting Force, you can see it go to the 4th enemy, which is right here. Each one of these blocks is 5 meters, so 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. If you put a range module on, you can see that it increases the range by 92%, which would make it around 60 meters. This is very good for ad clearing. However, I do believe with the newest iteration of buffs, there is a better module that we can have. If you do use Release Cutting Force, I highly recommend a range module because that will increase your output tremendously. One of the new modules being Ambushed. What this does is activates camouflage as normal, gives you a 30% movement speed increase and a cooldown increase of 30%. You can see that whenever I attack, oh, what the heck? Strange. So if you want to cycle your abilities faster, this is a really good module for infinite stealth or near infinite stealth. However, it still costs mana, so you're going to overextend yourself eventually.
Entering stealth state.
Then it's Fragile Rounds, the conversion of your shock nuts, turns it into a little rocket. This does substantial damage with a 1000 skill power modifier and 3.5 range, which when you combine it with your ambush, which increases the amount of damage you do, does several million, and even the electrocution damage afterwards is increased by the ambush effect. This is another really good ad clearing damage. You really have a lot of options here. The last one is called Area Suppression. This is the one I would prefer to have an HP amplification as well as an increased HP. This turns her 4th ability into a Fan of Knives. If you hit enough crits, it cools down immediately. This you can deal a lot of damage with in a short amount of time. Unfortunately, you do run into the issue where you are overextending yourself. The cooldown decrease is 1 second per critical hit, which means you would have to hit 20 enemies with critical hits in order to refresh the cooldown of the ability. This is not happening in a manner that is indicative of you surviving. If you're around enough enemies to constantly be proccing 20 enemies, you're just going to die anyway. It's kind of crazy. So I do recommend still MP conversion and nimble fingers for a lot of cooldown, but you don't really need to stress yourself about the cooldown. I have cooldown on my reactor just because right now is not the best reactor to farm, but this one was good enough. On a reactor, I highly recommend getting skill critical hit damage on Sharen. However, there is a lot of things that can go where the skill cooldown is. You can do skill cost, you can do fusion, and you can do electric. Those are the only really 3 I would settle with. Unfortunately, the skill cost maxes out around 4, so it isn't really effective unless you're already at the tail end of getting cost reduction. This is another module that can still be used for bossing because it is not the amount of enemies necessarily that you hit crits that reduce the cooldown. It is the amount of critical hits that you do. So the caveat to hitting 20 enemies is getting 20 critical hits. However, that's kind of easy whenever your enemy is a giant colossus. Now, remember, you still want the critical hit rate increase from the blue beetle. So start with the first ability and then get the damage increase from being in stealth. And you can do the same thing with this module. Sharen is a really good ad clear and a really good bossing descendant. Regardless, if you like Sharen, I highly recommend trying her new features out. If you don't want to do that, the old way of just equipping Overcharged Edge with an overwhelming HP on,
Initiating stealth.
going in stealth mode with the sniper rifle is still viable. Albeit, I do believe it has died a little bit to power creep with the rest of the modules. You can still do massive amounts of damage with one sniper shot, provided that you do crit. This requires kind of crit fishing. The other ways don't require crit fishing, but this is still completely viable to boss inside of an intercept. Behind me, you will see the Slayer set. This is what I will probably run until something better comes along. She doesn't need more crit rate. She's almost at 100% with a properly built kit, and you playing her effectively with the blue beetle. I did this video. I do a lot of testing, and I play on Twitch. If you're interested in that, check out in the description. Check out my channel if you like the way I do content. Consider subscribing. You'll have a sick day, and peace out.